So we left off in our first notes video talking about how selection can change a population, and we were envisioning a hypothetical trait that varies on a spectrum. Now, if we take a step back and think about how evolution could change a population, if we have something that's a simple Mendelian trait, like fur or no fur, the way that would change a population is relatively straightforward. There would either be more or less of that particular population, or the one particular phenotype in that population. So say fur might become more common and no fur might become less common. However, as we start to get to traits that are a little bit more genetically complicated, that have more complicated inheritance patterns, that vary across a spectrum, something like height, for example, we have to think about how that could change a population. And this is actually probably the majority of traits vary, at least to some extent, along a spectrum. So this is probably more applicable to how actually the majority of traits work. So pull up a different color here. We've envisioned this hypothetical population on our x-axis height. We have our different heights for humans. This might vary from, some somewhere down here under 5 feet to over, maybe over 7 feet spectrum of humans for males. And on our y-axis, we have number of individuals. So there'd be very few individuals that are less than 5 feet, and very few individuals over here that would be, say, more than 7 feet, and lots of individuals that are somewhere in this middle range of the 5'6" to 6'2" would be where most of the individuals were. So higher on our y-axis would be more individuals in the population of that particular height. Now, if selection is acting, we might expect this curve, this distribution of individuals, to change in a certain way. And this can change in one of three ways. The first is directional, and that's if one extreme of our curve is favored. So say if there was some reason why really tall people had some advantage, they're more likely to survive and reproduce for whatever reason, we would expect there to be more. So we would expect this part of the curve to be pulled up to somewhere up like here. And the shorter individuals wouldn't do as well, so that part of the curve would fall. So we would expect our curve kind of to maybe do something like this. So we see here is this directional shift of the peak of the curve, or where the average individual might over time become taller. We could also see that directional selection happen in the opposite way. If there was some reason why the shorter individuals were favored, we might see something where the curve could shift in that direction. So that's directional selection. We see a particular way, a direction that the curve is shifting. The second type of way that this can lead to a change is called stabilizing selection. And this would be where the intermediate, the middle of the spectrum, is for some reasons favored. So maybe the really tall people are gangly and awkward and can't run away from predators very well, and the really short people can't reach the food up in the trees as well. So we get less really short people, we get less really tall people, and we get more people in the middle. So this is known as stabilizing selection. The intermediate, the middle of the curve, is favored. So we get more. We're higher on our y-axis in the middle and lower on our y-axis on our two extremes. And we start to pinch our curve kind of in towards the middle and push the middle up. So that's stabilizing selection. You could imagine some circumstances where that might occur. And our final way that this curve could shift is known as disruptive selection. And that's kind of like directional selection happening at both ends of the spectrum at the same time. So maybe really short is favored because they can find food really easily on the ground, and maybe really tall is favored because they can find food high up in the trees, and being in the middle is not so good because it's hard to bend over and find food, and they also can't reach the high food very well. So we would expect there to be more of the really short people and more of our really tall people and less of our people in the middle. So what we start to see here is our one curve starting to split into two separate curves. We have this two-humped curve here. So it's being disrupted or divided into two. So both the two opposite ends are selected for, and our middle actually goes down here. And over time, this could eventually lead into two completely separate different curves. If we have like one curve and the middle goes completely down to 0, and our second curve after that, and what would happen there is we'd actually have one population that is eventually splitting into two separate populations. So that's what we're going to look at next, where if we have that one curve here actually split into two separate curves, that would be a case where one species is splitting into two species. Now, we'll revisit that after we talk about the other mechanisms for evolution here. So selection is the main way that evolution occurs. It's the most commonly talked about, and within those, natural selection being the most common, most well-known mechanism for evolution to occur. But there are other ways that evolution can occur as well. So the first one being what's called genetic drift. And this would be random chance events that influence the genetic makeup of a population. So this is kind of like selection, except instead of there being a particular reason why certain individuals survive, either through natural selection or artificial selection or sexual selection, individuals surviving and reproducing because of particular characteristics that they have, then rather it is just random chance events that cause a particular subset of individuals to survive and reproduce. Now, due to the way that random chance events work, and that random events have a larger effect on a smaller population. So this has a larger effect when we have small populations. If we have a really large population, if a few of them randomly die or randomly reproduce because, say, a hurricane strikes and happens to take away their habitat, or a fire comes by and kills them, which has nothing to do with the traits that they have, and the population is really large, it doesn't matter if a few of them die. But if the population is small, a few of them randomly dying has a large impact on the overall percent of that population. And this over time can lead to the loss of genetic variability, or what's called the fixation of alleles, which is when the elimination of all the other alleles happens, or that's the only allele that remains in the population. Or in other words, it's totally eliminating all the variability that existed within that population. If there's only one allele present in the entire population, every individual has that allele and there's no variation. Everybody looks the same for that particular trait. So because this affects small populations a lot more than large populations, there are two particular cases where this tends to come into play. One is known as the founder effect, where a small subset of the population leaves, migrates somewhere, and establishes a new population. So say there's an island offshore and some birds fly over to that new island, and now there are a new population of birds. Because that new population is relatively small, genetic drift can have a large impact on that population of who those individuals who randomly decided to leave and establish that population were. And the other common case of this is known as the bottleneck effect, where all but a small portion of the population goes extinct. So if there is a very small population and a lot of them are dying off, then again, we have a small population, there's only a few of them left. So we would expect there to be that a random chance event might have a disproportionately large effect on that population, just because there's so few of them. So some of them randomly dying would change the population a lot more than a few randomly dying in a large population. This is one of the reasons why when species are endangered and there's only a few of them left, this can be so detrimental. Even if the population recovers and goes back, they may have lost a lot of their genetic variability when they went through that bottleneck, when there was such a small population. And that variability is key to them surviving over time due to natural selection and other selection mechanisms of evolution. If they don't have that variability, they've lost that ability to survive due to natural selection. So that's genetic drift. It's kind of the random chance side of selection, rather than there being a reason for selection. It's just random individuals surviving and reproducing and passing on their traits, and that disproportionately affects small populations. Now, our third mechanism for evolution doesn't happen very often, but is actually necessary for all the other mechanisms to occur. And this is random changes in the DNA that lead to new alleles. So the mutations or changes in the DNA that create new alleles. So if there's going to be variability, at one point that variability had to at one point be created by mutations. So all the variability that natural selection and genetic drift and gene flow that we'll talk about next, that variability that's required for those was the result of mutations. So these are the raw material for evolution to act on. So if we think about if there's no variations, there'd be no variability, and if there's no variability, there can be no evolution. So these mutations, they don't happen all that often, but when they do, that's where all the variability that exists come from. And our fourth mechanism is known as gene flow. And this is if we have two different populations that are separated, that don't regularly interact with each other, but potentially could migrate between them, or individuals could change between them. So if we had that population of birds that lived on the island offshore and the population of birds that lived in the mainland, and they're two separate populations. So when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about a population, even if it's the same species, if they're separate populations that don't regularly interact with each other. If we have individuals that are moving between those, that can actually influence the evolution of each of those populations because they might be bringing in genes from the other population where they might be more or less common. So this is the result of emigration, individuals leaving a population. If a lot of individuals with one phenotype or set of alleles leave, that decreases the frequency of that phenotype. And immigration, if individuals with a certain phenotype come in, if a lot of hairless bunnies come into the population, that would influence the makeup of that population and therefore cause the overall population to change with that one event. So those are our four mechanisms for evolution. We can have selection, most commonly thought of changing a population, either through natural selection, sexual selection, or artificial selection, and that can change at least traits that vary on a spectrum in directional stabilizing or disruptive ways. And then genetic drift, gene flow can change the makeup of a population, and mutations change the makeup of a population by introducing new variability that didn't exist before. Now, when we think about evolution occurring, a lot of this happens over timescales of millions and millions of years, so we can't really see it happening in real time. Sometimes we can with something like bacteria that have a very short lifespan. We can actually observe them go through multiple generations and the population observe. But for the most part, we can't see evolution occurring, so we have to rely on other mechanisms of evidence. So we look at things like fossil and the body structure in existing individuals, the way their embryos, their babies develop, and their DNA sequences. And we can look at similarities between different individuals within a species and between species, and we can use that evidence. And if we look at these combined, if we look at multiple sources of evidence, if we look at fossils and DNA and different things together, we can combine that evidence of multiple ways to start to determine the evolutionary relationships between individuals in terms of how far apart those species split from each other and divided, and how closely related different species are. And as we put that together, we can build what's called a branching tree diagram, or a cladogram diagram is the more technical name for it. And this would show the relationships between individuals. So say at one point in time, here currently we have humans exist, and dogs exist, and sharks exist, and trees exist. At one point in time, we all shared a common ancestor, and then trees split off, but then sharks and dogs and humans were still more similar than trees. And then at some point, sharks split off, and humans and dogs were still more closely related. And then at some point, dogs and humans split off from each other. So we can, over time, build this tree, and we could start to fill in all sorts of different species that would show how closely related different species are to each other. Now, this process of species splitting off from each other is known as speciation, or the formation of a new species. And this typically follows three basic stages, although it can also happen in other ways, such as disruptive selection, as we saw above. The first is that there must be some sort of separation. A part of the population becomes separated from the rest of the population. Maybe they leave to go to a new island, or a new river is formed and splits them off. Whatever it is, it separates them. Then we have some adaptation. One of our various mechanisms of evolution changes those different populations, and they become different from each other, and there's two separated populations. And then finally, division, if enough changes accumulate, so even if that barrier were removed, if they came back together, they would no longer be able to interbreed, which was our definition of different species. So that would eventually split us into two completely new species.